it was more analytical and grew more morphological. As an example, the relative marker on the relative verb. No, comment on that later. And on the other hand, it must have been a bit agglutinative, is what I've heard say. And in the Northwest, it sort of fell apart, losing the object marker as a morpheme. So that kind of bigger question of where was Proto-Bantu on this spectrum? Yes.
Well, one thing we've been talking a little about is so there's a lot of literature now by Greg Anderson looking at auxiliary or general verbal constructions in African languages. He has this continental survey, and then he looked at also on what I call the Macro-Zam belt, and what he finds is actually a very common pattern is there's no single event of morphologizing everything in one bit, but rather subject marking fusing to an auxiliary or a particle, and this can actually stay separate from the rest of the. And he's trying to reconstruct that for Central Sudanic, for Chadic, he's looking at this in Niger Congo, and well, my impression is if you look at zone A, that's what you find. You have subject markers fusing with a vowel, and this is the marker of past or present. So I think we should be aware of the possibility of several cycles of that event. So if a locative copula and an infinitive joins in a construction in a Savannah Bantu language, it's the same process, but much later than, for instance, earlier. So it's not only everything separate and then in one go joining it, but rather possibly this what I call split predicate stage should be looked for more systematically.
I've been wanting to say, and this is a good time maybe, since Tom just used the magic phrase zone A, this is not a homogeneous area, and this has come up before in numerous cases, and even hearing some of the papers today and seeing the distribution of things. It's kind of striking. I was very struck in Fatima's paper, for example, that zone A looked very homogeneous in what she had, even though there are languages there that mark the object pronouns before the verb, that still have that, and so forth. And in other cases, and that sometimes also related to what you brought up about the role of morphology. Because sometimes when I hear in zone A they do this or something, I'm saying, are you talking about a geographic area? Are you talking about some kind of genetic grouping? Or are you just talking about a type? Because that's where we're going to find more of the analytic type of systems, although they are found elsewhere as well. And I always like to cite Nzadi, which is quite deep into zone B, that tail that goes down the Kasai River, you know. So, it's not always clear to me what's being referred to there, and if we're, and especially the ones that when it was carried out into the rest of Niger Congo, you know, it was starting with a certain kind of thing one finds in zone A and not zone A itself.
I agree. So just to make it clear, when in my talk, when I talked about homogeneity, it was just for the SV of 20 languages, right? So it's like you have to be careful with how you use it's only 20 languages. They happen to be homogeneous only on SV, because if you look at the object marking, so if you go like on my slides, if you go to the graph where you have like blue, yellow, and brown, like the slide 33, you do see that in zone A, all three types are represented. So you have languages which have only the infix. Some languages have both the infix and some sort of object pronoun or suffix, and some only have the object pronoun. So, you know, only that shows you that that it's very diverse, that. Right?
So it was striking that you had no VS there.
Yeah, exactly.
Independent of the
the
rest of the morphology.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, like during the break, so for me the idea is that as Bantu languages are SVO overall, for me the VS is the thing to kind of explain. And so the fact that many languages have SV, even those which have the object marker, is not an issue in itself, because it's like overall those languages are SV, so it shouldn't surprise us that, we shouldn't be surprised that my zone A languages have SV. What should surprise is that none of them has VS in a way. Right? I guess that's where I would start.
I think that's calling for an explanation. Can I ask you quickly another question, though, which is, since SV is so widespread in the world, how do you always know that they don't have VS? Do the grammars always say that? They don't usually say what you don't have. You know?
Yeah, no, some of them
is there any problem with that methodologically? Can you be confident that they don't have VS?
No, so the thing is that, again, everything I'm saying you have to take with a word of caution, because I'm consulting very many grammars and so on. So it's like, I'm not saying, so some language, and actually I even said many languages might have VS. It was maybe just not mentioned that this was also an option. But I think in many, knowing that VS is so present in certain areas, some authors actually do say, and Tsuka also says sometimes, that SV is the only possibility. And so no, it's not an issue generally speaking, and people do provide negative information as to what you don't have sometimes. And am I answering your question? I'm sorry.
I think you are.
Yeah. So VS is not an issue in general, and it's not surprising, and sometimes you know that it's not there, and it might be there in zone A. I mean, it's like there are so many languages. Of course, I'm just showing you one picture based on a sample.
If it was very prominent, it probably would be mentioned without any question.
Exactly,
yeah.
and so far I haven't seen it being mentioned. And if anyone knows of a zone A language that has VS, please let us know.
Maybe I don't know how to formulate, but just to react to one little detail of the way you presented things, about the question of whether relativizers are being integrated in the verb or not. So I think the reasonings that you want to avoid are those in which you say, okay, we have reasons to think that Proto-Bantu had this overall typological profile, therefore we should think that relativizers probably, since it was analytical, probably didn't link to the verb and were not integrated into the verb. The reason why I said that they probably didn't was due to a very specific scenario that can be followed in individual constructions, and that doesn't have a path from an initial verbal prefix, from an initial pronominal prefix back to an initial verbal prefix. And I think in general it's important to think in terms of scenarios, and to think in terms of scenarios in the evolution of constructions, not of languages. And it's difficult to keep this in mind, because we tend to generalize or to think in metaphors. And for instance, what for me illustrates this very well is one of the things that the literature discussed about relative clause constructions, namely that people saw that there is a correlation between whether or not the relativizer is a prefix or a clitic versus a separate word, so the degree of morphological bonding of the relativizer, and the position of the subject, whether it's pre-verbal or post-verbal in non-subject verbs. And so linguists are trained to, if they see such a correlation, to see it as two symptoms of one thing, that is one deeper property of a language. So that's why Givon said, oh, there must be a functional principle that says that the relativizers want to be close to the relativized noun. And then Demuth and Harford, they said, okay, let's modernize this intuition, and no, it's because they say it's because the relativizer is part of the relative verb, that the relative verb had to move up to C position with the relativizer. But these are very abstract Platonic ideas, and they both had it backwards. The reason was that the relativizer can't integrate into the verb if the subject is in between them. And that's a trivial reason. And so I think in general we should give preference to trivial explanations if we have the choice, rather than to functional explanations, for instance, which can be anything in general. Yeah.
But it's a rare thing that where you get that. You know,
It's
the book,
well,
the child that he read,
Mhm.
you know, and that's the order in Luganda.
Right.
Yeah.
No, but Luganda is a bit. I mean, Luganda. I've also explained how you get there, but that's not. That's they
I thought
don't
that you were
even.
talking about the
Yes, but they don't even discuss this in the Givon and
We
Harvard.
talks
And,
about it, yeah.
Hmm?
He definitely talks about it, yeah. And I'm not sure which article, because it was his student, Walusi.
Well, that's not
Yeah.
this issue.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
This-
thought that's what you
No,
were
no, no.
talking
The issue is whether they saw a correlation between whether the relativizer is a separate word versus a prefix and the position of the
about. And
subject.
that this would be an extreme case of it not being separate if it's getting, if
Well-
it's out of place even. Yeah.
Yes, this is a different issue. It's
Okay.
you see here that the relativizer is slowly being integrated into the verb. Yeah. Maybe I was.
Yeah, I was thinking during your, the beginning, that's seems to be the way to go. You have your scenario. I love the bra scenario, and that's one way in which you show, well, this must have been the morphological, analytic, or well, more analytic setup for a previous stage for Proto-Bantu. And therefore we have one piece of evidence that this must have been that sort of type, rather than the other way around.
Exactly. Yes.
Do I understand you
Yes,
correct?
yes,
Which gives us one piece of information, and then we need to find a similar...
Which is firmly grounded in a scenario that has been, verified in millions of other ways. Yes.
Yeah.
But obviously, for many problems that we are discussing, we will never find such a scenario. And then the question is, are those? Can we find an explanation for those? Maybe not. Maybe we're too ambitious.
So that also brings me to another question that came up in Rasmus and Maud's talk, which is if a construction is typologically prevalent, does that argue in favor of reconstructing it, or does it argue in favor of reinventing it, or maybe both? And I thought that was an interesting typological, like methodological question as well. Did Kung want to say something?
Can I just ask, are we going to back to the frequency question, or is it a different? So sorry, I'm trying to be. I'm still jet lagged, so I need extra explanation.
Sorry.
So are we going back to the frequency question, or I'm not trying to understand the difference between your question and the frequency question we were asking yesterday? Is it the same or is it different?
I wasn't there yesterday.
Yes,
it's
Okay, so
it's
I'm sorry.
pretty much the same.
It's the same question, right? Okay. So sorry. Sorry.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
sorry.
agree.
Then
So,
I looked
No. I want to address it, but I just want to make sure that this is what you are asking. So that's the same question. So okay. So
Good.
Fine.
Go ahead. Then address it.
no. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So actually, that's something I did not mention, but it's relevant for Maud and Rasmus stuff. So I think. At least from what, so I showed you graphs, and what I am offering for Proto-Bantu is actually not the most frequent type nowadays. So I can find my graph again. What I'm offering pretty much is that Proto-Bantu, what I'm proposing is that Proto-Bantu is a SVVS, so meaning you have both pre-verbal and post-verbal lexical subjects. And if you look at the data, it's like only, I think, 13 out of 150 languages actually are so based on the limited amount of data I have and what people say or they don't say and so on. So far, there's only 13. I think there are more than that, but even if there are more, I don't think that most languages that are now only VS or only SV would fall into that SVVS category. I'm talking about present day Bantu. And yeah, so I think I would go towards, yeah, you don't necessarily want the most. So what matters is, for me, the distribution is good because you see it from B to S, this type. So if I summarize, right, it's widespread. It's not that frequent, but it's pretty widespread. And actually, as I said, it's like if you want to use the most frequent type, VS type, for instance, you still have to like explain, and that's what Suka does, is that you still have to posit that something that is marked in a way in the simple sentences would be the basic order. So I think maybe like that's like what we're talking about today about the word order in relative clauses, and it's like, yeah, you can maybe still accept that the marked word order nowadays used to be the like basic word order in main sentences in the past, but I think I would still go for, we can also have the option like the dinosaur that we talked about this morning, which is you had both orders, and then, yeah, that was the dinosaur that gave the chicken, right? So, or the egg, I'm not sure. So yeah, you can have both options, and actually that would account for like, for the what you have the distribution today, so.
Yeah, it was not the same question, but I'll let Koen,
Okay.
No, it's to, well, we've discussed the frequency question, but I would like to pick in something Larry said. Yeah, of course, zone A is not a unity, but it's very diverse. But the fact that you find something in zone A, and I think like for Fatima, she showed zone B as one zone, but if you looked at her map, I think some of the features were B10, B20,
Yeah.
B30, so that's this, again, this northwest in a phylogenetic sense. So I think this is important, the fact that because internally, phylogenetically, the Northwest is much more diverse, and if you find one specific feature across these branches, for me, this is telling. This is more telling than if you find one specific feature spread across like the rest of Western Bantu, which are later split-offs, which are less diverse than within the Northwest. So I think it is relevant to see the.
Yeah. No, I saw that also in that talk. That some of the B was like A in those graphs, and I figured it was the contiguous parts. But I'm reacting to it, like for example, Greg Anderson's staff thing. Even the idea of the subject fusing with Basa doesn't do that. So we have some languages like Wakweri that have what looks like real Bantu, right? And then we have more isolating like Basa that at least we write them separately. We don't think of them gliding. The subject is kind of standing alone, and then there's a tense marker B or something or whatever it is, and all that. So we've got a wide range of phenomena. So when I hear somebody say, zone A, is as a kind of monolith, it just we have to be careful, because also when in Maud and Rasmus' paper, when they had 3 types. 2 of the types required that there be a suffix or a clitic, or some kind of an affix or a clitic. I think say, well, if you're really isolated, when you take it out and you say, well, here's what we get in Yoruba, obviously you're not going to get much chance of that kind of structure, because the typology of the language is completely different. So I'm going to say, okay, what is it correlating with? Why was that class 3 empty almost for one of the tables? It says, well, what's the morphology like in those languages? So that would make a lot of sense. If you've got that extreme isolating kind of structure, then you're probably not going to express something as an affix.
But I'm not sure I could follow Fatima's reasoning completely. But if the type which is only a test of which the Northwest only has, like zone A, is the most marked, and it's not the most marked.
Actually, it's the least marked, because that's the order you have in the main sentences, right? So they all have SV. Based on what I'm looking at, okay, they all have SV, and Bantu languages overall have SV. So the fact that they have SV in itself is not really strange. The question is like what gives SV there and potentially SV and VS or only VS in some other languages, and so yeah.
Yeah, so it's more difficult to suppose that VS
Was the basic yeah.
no, that SV developed independently afterwards, right? That would be
Yeah.
because it's too marked.
So
That's
the other way around.
no.
so the idea is that the marked
VS, yeah.
VS is marked. So VS is marked. I mean, okay, I'm not a historical linguist, so maybe sometimes I'm not like. But so the idea is that VS is the marked order in the context where you have SV. Or if you want to talk in terms of marked and unmarked, I didn't go this way at the beginning, but VS would be for me the marked type because you have independently SVO in a very consistent way everywhere else in those grammars. And so the question is like, where do you get your VS from? And so, and Bantu A in my data doesn't have it at all. And so for me, the idea would be to say, it's not like Proto-Bantu was SV and at some point you developed VS and those languages are in a way, it's rather that the option of VS SV was already present in their common ancestor. And so for morphological reasons and losing word order flexibility independently of that, my Bantu A, I think, but I mean, again, it's a proposal, have preferred SV. But some of them might have been SV even before losing the infix, because anyway, SV is the basic word order and you should not be surprised. Just like the S languages are, like many of them are SV, and that should not be a surprise to us. So those two things, you know, it's like you might have lost some VS, but SV was already, both of them were already there from start. And that's where I say that in this sense, Proto-Bantu would have been like French, because instead of French, you have in one grammar the two options. So,
and I
that's
think
my
that can
diagnosis.
be extended from the relative clauses to the main clauses.
Exactly.
Where you will have the flexibility
Exactly.
as well.
And you see the same flexibility in like the OVS that we've been talking about and so on. You find it more to the east. You don't find it everywhere either from your sample, for instance. But you don't find it in the languages that I mean, some information is missing, as I said, in Bantu ABC, but I don't know that people have reported that we have OVS more to the west, northwest, I don't know. And so in that sense, it would be consistent with the idea that Proto-Bantu had both VS and SV, both in embedded clauses and in main sentences, which is consistent with mod and Rasmus
Exactly.
that you had existentials where you had VS.
Yeah.
And that's consistent with what you said, that VS was probably already there, so you had both.
Yeah, we agree.
The,
We don't.
yes. No, yes, but I think there is a way that we could summarize some of the discussion, the brief discussion between Koen and Larry, in the sense that we actually really have bad luck that in the area where we have the deepest genealogical diversity participates in a very active linguistic area, where some of the information that could have helped us reconstruct has been wiped out.
Yes.
So it's really bad luck. Maybe we should pick another family.
Why wiped out? I mean,
Why?
why?
Because of aerial influence.
Yeah, but
I
that's
mean, the
also-
diversity, it has not been wiped out, it has been distributed and it has diversified, but it hasn't,
Yeah,
it has not been wiped out. And
I think the
of
problem
course,
is
It hasn't
Well,
been entirely
it's
wiped
very
out.
good.
you also
It has
have
been-
stamp morphemes in zone, which you didn't mention.
Yeah,
So
it has
it's
been
just
altered.
diverse.
It hasn't
Yes,
been.
it
It
has
has been
everything.
altered. It has been altered in ways that.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think for me the issue is we don't have enough data yet because we said, as I said, that I found 20, I have data from 20 languages, and I feel like we are missing a lot of data from this area, right? And if you look at the samples also in the other talks, like other works, like the East and South are much more they are much more described than what. My impression is that, ABC is often underrepresented and that you don't have as much work or it's not as available as work from other. So it's hard to have an accurate picture. That's my impression.
No, but what, like in Yannick's talk, she opposed metatony in the west to conjoint disjoint in the east, and then like as if both would be innovations, but the fact that Metatony is in the northwest and the rest of that, there's much more diversity there. So that, for me, that's much more relevant in terms of reconstruction, even if it's completely absent in the east. That's something that could be an old retention.
I hear that, I know that.
Yeah, so
I understand.
I don't think, but at this idea that everything in the northwest would have been wiped out due to later contact, I think that's, yeah, but that's something that many people have in their minds, and also.
But
like
would you reconstruct Metatony?
Well, I don't know. But
It's not one thing.
I'm thinking in terms of distribution. For each of the features, the details need to be looked at. But.
Yeah. I mean, we do get we do get conjoint disjoint once you get into agam. So, but it looks very different. In fact, I wanted to say that about some of these things, including what Derek reports on in his book and since, that some of the very things that we see very agglutinated and even forms, like when he talks about ka or something as a prefix, and you go out to Bamileke and the other grass fields and you say, gee, it looks like they're just doing it right now. They've got some forms that look kind of similar, and the same thing with what we were just talking about. The fact, how is it that, or take the multiple past tenses. Those seem to be, they're obviously very integrated and they're very complex in the narrow Bantu area, because you can see that they're not, when you look at those the tables of conjoint disjoint, or you look at the various past 1, past 2, past 3, whatever, it's not neat. One of them has kept the ile here, one has an ah there, one has a prefix there, that, so it's all somehow, some older thing has been reshaped. Whereas when you look at the multiple past tenses in Grassfields Bantu, you can see what verbs they came from, because the verbs are still around. And you can see that they have the tones of being consecutivized in some cases, that it's return and do something, or spend the night and do something, So you say, well, how does this idea get repeated like that? There's something that happened a long time ago over here and is very integrated in the system, and here we've got it just happening over here, and we're supposed to be the homeland.
But that's exactly what I was saying. If there is something that happens again and again and again, and we know that typologically all over the world, not just in the Bantu area, then is that an argument to say, well, therefore we reconstruct it, or is that an argument to say, therefore all languages at all times have done this again and again?
Except what we have apparently is fairly rare in the world, right? So it's somehow they
verbs developing to
stumbled
tense
on an
markers?
idea that the languages and that the people in these areas like. So, but I don't think the recycling would affect the reconstruction in a way. If you had the older stuff, it would be more relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think there are two different issues. If it's a typological feature, or if it's really universal, then the answer is clear. If it's frequent, it's as an historical argument, it's less good, because the chance is that it could arise more equally, independently. But the question is, in this sense, one shouldn't only talk typologically, but really look at concrete forms. If a universal or a frequent process is tied to a particular form, and there is a client, then I think it's a better argument. So, for instance, ka. Well, we have possibly kas which are unbound in our controversial area. We have Igbo ka, and there it's go. And then we have the ka sequential or consecutive, or in Bantu. And then, well, this looks as if there was an independent verb ka in Niger Congo, Benue Congo as a verb, and in certain cases it got eventually bound. So it's so I think, and that's why I was trying to really look at concrete forms, for instance, pronouns, not just abstractly talking about something and typological processes and what happens, but rather seeing what happens with this particular form. And I think there is growing evidence that you see those elements which are bound in Bantu lose somewhere outside that area. And I think so we should stop talking just about processes, but really about concrete form.
But if we can reconstruct a form for Go, it can grammaticalize independently. Because that's so incredibly common, right? Igbo ga, for example, is the future marker. You know,
Yes, but as historical linguists, you say, okay, they are cognate, and in one area profile, it's an independent verb, and in the other, where there is actually a good argument.
But the Igbo case is recent. I mean, you can see that because it's ga plus a verbal noun.
Yes, but you have the verb.
Yeah.
So ga and Igbo could be cognate with the post-initial, with the post-initial.
But that's only relevant for reconstructing that lexical item, not for reconstructing a construction.
That's not well.
There's a verb go. And maybe it's related to Gend for all I know. You know, so because we don't do the comparative method with these things, you know, but we say it look ga sounds like ka, you know, so they must be cognate.
Okay.
No, but what that was what I think. But Rasmus has a question. Maybe he had a remark.
No, not with that. But maybe I was just having a good comment. That is cognitive existential in that case. That's a typologically extremely quirky thing. It's almost confined to. I mean, even the first continuation, cognitive to possessive, is okay. We have it in some parts of the world. But Scott's typological work says very to and then this further extension to the existential reading is more or less only confined to that languages, and we also can link it up with this marker, the noun marker, and its variants. So that is a strong argument, and that would be using something that is typologically unusual to kind of argue for that it could be perhaps reconstructible. But then, of course, but at least to know free again, something like that. Yeah, that's just what a remark I had on this. So it wasn't really connected.
Yeah, but you mean if something is typologically marked or uncommon, and you find it widespread within the Bantu family, then that's a stronger argument to reconstruct it.
Yeah. As far as I understand the theoretical literature on reconstruction, there is a strong argument.
Because it's less likely to innovate or have innovated independently.
Yeah. If compared to these Go works, for example, that have they're only present in one of the world.
Or Finnish.
With some functions, or Finnish.
Yeah, I like to quote a person in the room who a few days ago actually said that typology knows a little about the languages of the world, because there are so many languages which haven't been described yet. But to say that something is typologically frequent or infrequent, how valid of an argument is that?
Yeah, and I would like to add, if I may, to Sebastian's comment, and also to Larry's comment, if I understand correctly, that we want to perhaps reach a higher stage where we don't just reconstruct a single little piece that may sound and look like something else, but we want to see how that piece developed inside of an entire construction. Then maybe we should look, or no, maybe you already know about this, but is it possible to reconstruct entire syntactic constructions? This has been a controversial topic, I believe, since the 1980s with people like Harris, Mithun, Campbell, and more recently with people working in this university. I think they're developing this idea, how do we somehow incorporate the comparative method within syntactic reconstruction of entire constructions, how do we say that just because we find that particle there and there in two different patches of grammar, why is it so that those two constructions within one same language come from each other? So internal reconstruction. And then the next stage, does this internal reconstruction that we posit, do we find it somewhere else too? And then how do we bring all of these ideas together into creating a sound methodology to reconstruct entire bigger chunks and not just single morphemes? That's the idea. Like, what are the arguments to say two constructions are cognate? Are those the same as the ones that we have with the comparative method or not? Do we have any good arguments? I think that's maybe, no?
So really the question, how do we establish what are cognates for construction?
Exactly, just because we find that piece in the synchronic grammar of a language, well, okay, but that might be chance. Like, what are our proofs that those two things should be in fact, related, so that you say, oh, I internally reconstruct this, and I think that it is most likely that one developed into two and not the other way around. Yeah.
Obviously, one kind of small thing that, of course, for the construction is even nicer if you have several morphemes that you can reconstruct together for one single construction. That would be a stronger case, I think. So I totally agree with you. But of course, the morphemes are often phonologically unique.
Phonologically?
Unique.
Oh.
So a morpheme will mean combined. If you compare it with a more abstract construction, so to say. So it's very nice if you can have, both have the cake and eat it, so to say. You can both try to find morpheme cognates, and maybe you can look at the whole construction and how different, more or less schematic morphemes may combine together with lexical material as well. That the lexical material can, of course, be different instantiations. But I think that the way forward would be to look at the whole construction, but all the skeleton, like all the different morphemes, and see if you can find.
Yeah, and then maybe in that way it's also easier to see like how the mechanisms of syntactic change operate or not in that construction, in that language, and maybe elsewhere, like reanalysis or analogy, or borrowing is a risky one, but yeah.
If I could just respond quickly. First of all, I think in terms of grammatical morphemes, pronouns are great. What Tom is doing is great. That's stuff we can have confidence in, because that doesn't depend on a constant grammaticalization thing. That something could be constantly renewed. The other one would be lexical. I mean, basically, because if we can find one of the problems with relating, since I really worked through Bukarovsky's book, 2 books on Western Nigritic and all that, and the problem, the reason why John Stewart could do something was because Akan keeps some final consonants. If you're looking at Igbo and Yoruba and you get CV morphemes, it's very hard, so if you had something like just take Tima, for example, as a random example, and you find C somewhere, is that cognate? T could become S and you drop the second syllable, that, so you can guess, but it's not as clear as if you found seam, that somewhere, So that's the other possibility we have. The problem with the kinds of issues that we often are talking about with constructions and markers of whether it's tense aspect or whatever, is that there's this constant renewal. And you get 2 dialects that have radically different ways of marking those things. And then we only have a finite number of CV syllables. Ka and ga, those sound pretty similar. What about ka and ke? What about, and so forth. Any number of things can happen. That's really harder. And so if I see a language just creating it right now, then I would say I don't take that as great evidence.
Yeah, so Larry, it really surprised me when you mentioned pronouns and something stable and not changing, nothing.
Why don't they change?
Yeah. Like when you look in Bantu, Professor Kanban was doing his book on pronouns and Bantu. I mean,
I'm sorry, I should have said subject pronouns.
I mean, bound not because they came from somewhere anyway.
Yeah.
But they're just, I mean, it can become, it's all, so much stuff is happening with pronouns. It can constantly
Yeah,
renewal and the reinforcement.
Yeah, I know in the Western Grassfields we lost the third person pronouns. You know,
It's
so.
just kind of, I was
Yeah.
so surprised when you mentioned
Yeah, I
it.
know. Okay, so even there we have to be careful. We always have to be careful. You know, but if you find, you know, a set of pronouns in relatively distant languages, as Tom was showing us.
No, but how
That's
can we be
pretty-
sure then? How can we be sure that?
How do you know there that they're coming?
Well,
Yes, how do you know? I mean,
first of all, if it's a set, then I'm happier than if it's an isolated pronoun, right? You know, that would be one thing, I think. Tom, you're not saying anything.
As Tom
Come in and
pointed
help
out,
me.
there are tendencies to
No, I mean, I think, look what Johanna Nichols tried to do, you know, with pronouns and all that, you know, that, again, I'm sure that everything has its limitations. But if I had to compare the tense aspect markers, I think I'd be a little scared if I did it at the same level, you know. Also, or even the verb extensions, you know, because when you compare with Atlantic, for example, where almost all the extensions are coronals, consonants, you know, like that, and say, well, if our applicative il or whatever, il, you say, well, it could be an N, it could be a T, it could be an R, it could be we can relate it to anything, you know. You know, we wouldn't relate it to a K probably, but, or would we actually, if it's from Keat or Kiel or?
Kun wanted to add something.
Some correspondences. There can be other correspondences for the same sounds with other lexical items.
Yeah.
That could prove
No, if
that
you could
those-
show that, that's
Yeah,
great,
yeah,
but
it can
I
happen.
don't think we have been able to show that. On the other hand, when you compare with Cordofanian, they don't look alike at all. They have similar, you know, similar system, but they really look different.
Kun?
No, I was also surprised that Larry brought up lexicon as a stable. So is
That's
that
the tradition.
happily, but maybe that's an invitation to organize Bantu lexical reconstruction. Berkeley, no?
4?
Yeah. Next year in Berkeley. Why
Yes.
not? That'd be great.
It would.
Let's discuss this over dinner.
No, when you see Liam over there, or Mel even, way over in the West, I mean, I'm happy for Tom, you know, right? I mean, that's, how can you deny that, right? That's just too good.
And not only that, but it goes along with doom and loom.
Yeah, exactly. Doom to buy, doom to send or to work. There are all these ones that, yeah. D for ride, D for eat. Yeah, I mean, there's some that are just, you know, obviously these are related languages.
So do we want to say anything else about grammatical reconstruction?
Let's stop it.
It's hopeless. Let's change the topic of this.
There is one. Yeah. There is one other thing. So as you heard yesterday, there is a recording of Mielson's voice, and Maud didn't have that in the presentation, but she
it's not really, I mean, it's a recording by Nielsen doing field work, so it's just here a short statement in the beginning that it says like, well, I'm
So we
doing
can
field work, so it's
hear
very short. It's not a-
Mielson's field work.
Yeah. What, I didn't. No. So it's very short, so it's not kind of an interview with doing it's him doing field work.
That's so interesting. While you're setting that up, I had a wild idea. Couldn't we use your parameters that the SOAS project, the Liberian project used, and try to fill them in for Proto-Bantu, see what we could agree on? That might be an exercise for tomorrow.
Yeah.
You mean all the parameters?
Yeah.
Yeah, for Proto-Bantu.
Yeah.
Ah, you want to do that now?
No.
You can.
But I think that if we want to like get concrete, this is what we think we can reconstruct, or this is what our best guess is, improving on or revising or accepting Nielsen's. So if you're willing, if you have a document to share, it might be worthwhile putting that in the Dropbox, and then we can look at that. Think about it.
It's not a document.
I have my little list of changes to Nielsen.
Which this document
That is what I'm doing.
You already know.
Like maybe.
Yeah. Where are these secret keys? Are there other ones that can other thoughts?
Which year is this, by the way?
Far already. You are too far already.
We are in 1851. De France.
Who is that?
We are in 1851. De France.
Which language does this speak?
Dutch,
Little Dutch or something.
1951, he says. 1951.
What do you hear? So I hear Minag.
No, 1951.
It reminds me of
Was he
this.
working on 851?
It reminds me of there was this conceptual artist in Belgium some years ago who claimed that they had found pottery which you can hear Proto-Bantu. The women, when they were making
thing was turning.
yeah, was turning with needles. They were making ornaments and they were talking meanwhile. So.
Oh, I wish.
So we should look at this guy's reconstruction. Maybe he has ideas as well.
I listened to that recording.
Well,
No,
it's not finished.
Still market. Well, I had to try. I was skeptical.
You want to take it?
No, it's
Yeah, no, I don't think you do.
But there's this thing.
Okay.
American style. They can actually recover significant conversations from vibration.
I think we're done for today. The conference dinner starts at 7:30. It's on the